There is a manuscript scroll in the British Library, in the Stein collection of Dunhuang materials, that describes what happens to a human soul in the 10 days, the 100 days, and the 3 years after death. It was recovered from a sealed cave library in the Mogao complex in western China in the early 20th century. The scroll is written in vertical Chinese characters on brown paper, approximately 28 centimeters tall and, when unrolled, several meters in length. It is one of dozens of surviving copies of a text known as the Sutra of the 10 Kings. The scroll names 10 judges. It describes 10 courts. It gives specific instructions for what happens at each. And in the 6th court, ruled by a judge named King Biancheng, the text describes something that the other 9 courts do not describe. The Sutra was recovered by the Hungarian-British explorer Aurel Stein during his expedition to Dunhuang in 1907. Stein carried away thousands of manuscripts from a walled-up cave that had been sealed for approximately 900 years. The Sutra of the 10 Kings was among them. It is called the Shiwangjing. And what happens when you read it not as folklore but as what it appears to be, a bureaucratic manual for the disposition of the human soul, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed accounts of the afterlife in any ancient literature. The Sutra of the 10 Kings, in its Dunhuang manuscript form, is a Buddhist text composed in Chinese sometime between the 7th and 10th centuries CE. Multiple copies were sealed inside Cave 17 of the Mogao complex, a hidden library discovered by a Taoist monk in 1900. When Stein arrived 7 years later, he purchased a large portion of the collection. Paul Pelliot, a French sinologist, arrived in 1908 and took another portion. The scrolls are now divided between the British Library in London, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and smaller holdings in Beijing and St. Petersburg. Painted illustrated versions, long horizontal scrolls showing each of the 10 kings on his throne, with the tortured or judged souls at his feet, survive in the British Museum, the Musée Guimet in Paris, and the Nara National Museum in Japan. The illustrations are not decorative. Each of the 10 kings has a specific administrative function. Each court processes the soul in a specific sequence. The names of the courts and the names of the kings vary slightly across manuscripts, but the sequence and the functions are consistent. The 10th and final court, ruled by King Juanlun, sends the soul to rebirth. The 10th court is not the end, it is the return. The 9th court weighs merit. The 8th handles specific karmic debts. The 7th is a court of retrieval, of unfinished business. The 5th court is presided over by King Yama himself, the judge whose name travelled from Vedic India through Buddhism into China, changing shape along the way. And between the 5th court, where Yama pronounces the initial verdict, and the 7th court, where unfinished karmic accounts are retrieved, sits the 6th court, King Biancheng. In the standard mainstream reading, the 6th court is a place of torment. The soul is punished for lies and slanders committed in life, and the illustrated scrolls show the specific tortures assigned to that category of offence. But in a subset of the Dunhuang manuscripts, and in later folk Buddhist expansions of the Sutra, the 6th court is described as doing something entirely different. Not punishing, erasing. The name of the soul is removed from the celestial register. The karmic thread, the continuity that connects one life to the next, is severed. What arrives at the 7th court is no longer the person who died. The Sutra names this outcome. It gives, in some copies, the conditions under which it occurs, and the specific claim that this video will examine is that the 6th court, in the earliest and least edited Chinese afterlife records, is not a place of punishment at all. It is a place of unmaking. The reading has been proposed, it has not been refuted. No competing translation of the specific passages accounts for what the manuscripts actually say. If you find that the academic literature on Chinese Buddhist afterlife texts has been incomplete, if you suspect that there are manuscripts sitting in museum vaults in London and Paris waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The mainstream scholarly reading of the Sutra of the 10 Kings and of the 10 courts of the underworld as they appear in Chinese religious history was established most authoritatively by Stephen F. Tyser, Professor of Religion at Princeton University. His book, titled The Scripture on the 10 Kings and the Making of Purgatory in Medieval Chinese Buddhism, was published in 1994 by the University of Hawaii Press. Tyser argued that the 10 Kings tradition emerged as a synthesis. Indian Buddhist ideas about karmic judgment, Chinese ancestral ritual concerning the disposition of the dead, Taoist bureaucratic imagery of celestial officials keeping registers of the living and the dead. In Taisa's reading, the Sutra is essentially a Chinese Buddhist purgatory text, an instructional manual for the living, explaining what happens to the dead across the 10 days, the 100 days, and the 3 years of post-mortem ritual observance. The Sixth Court, in Taisa's careful scholarly reading, is one of several courts of specific punishment. The soul is judged for particular categories of moral failing, false speech, slander, deception, and receives a proportional torment. The tortures depicted in the illustrated scrolls are graphic. Souls are shown pulled apart by demons, tongues are extracted, bodies are boiled. Taisa treats these as pedagogical images, meant to enforce moral behavior in the living. The scholarly consensus following Taisa is that the 10 courts represent a bureaucratization of Buddhist karma, a Chinese cultural adaptation in which the abstract mechanism of cause and effect is rendered as a series of judicial hearings before named officials. Other mainstream scholars have broadly accepted this framework. Michel Strickmann, who worked on Chinese Tantric and Taoist texts before his death in 1994, treated the 10 Kings as a syncretic development within medieval Chinese religion. Timothy Barrett of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London has written on the way in which Tang and Song Buddhism absorbed and reshaped Chinese ritual traditions surrounding death. Eric Zerker, the Dutch sinologist who taught at Leiden University for decades, described the process by which Indian Buddhist eschatology was translated, not just linguistically but conceptually, into Chinese categories. In all of these mainstream readings, the Sixth Court punishes. The 10th Court, at the end of the sequence, sends the soul back to be reborn. The system is a wheel. Nothing is ever truly lost, only recycled through the karmic mechanism. The illustrations serve moral instruction. The manuscripts serve ritual practice. The Sutra of the 10 Kings, in the standard reading, is essentially a handbook for the correct performance of mortuary rites, aimed at the family of the deceased and at the monks and Taoist priests who officiated at those rites. The specific timing of the 10 courts is tied to the specific timing of Chinese ancestral ritual. The first 7 courts correspond to the 7 weekly observances that a Chinese family was expected to perform for the deceased during the first 49 days after death. The 8th court corresponds to the 100th day observance. The 9th corresponds to the 1-year anniversary of the death. The 10th corresponds to the 3-year anniversary, at which point the mourning period ended and the soul was understood to have been sent onward to rebirth. The Sutra of the 10 Kings, in the mainstream reading, is a text that a monk would consult in preparing the rituals for each of these observances, and the family would consult in understanding what their deceased relative was experiencing at each stage. The tortures depicted in the illustrated scrolls were, in this reading, a warning to the living. Behave well, or your relatives will not be able to save you from what King Biancheng and his colleagues assign to the wicked at each court. The 6th court in the mainstream reading punishes lies and slanders, offences of speech, because those are the specific karmic burdens that the 7-week observance of the 6th week is understood to address. What the mainstream reading does not address in detail is the specific vocabulary used in the earliest surviving copies. That silence is where the alternative reading begins. The break in the conventional reading comes from a small number of scholars and translators who have looked closely at specific Dunhuang manuscripts. Not the composite standardized text that circulated in later centuries, but the earlier variant copies preserved in Cave 17. The Dunhuang Kashi is unusual because it was sealed. Most Chinese Buddhist texts survived through repeated copying and editing over the centuries, with earlier variants lost as the standardized versions replaced them. The Dunhuang manuscripts were sealed in approximately 1035 CE and not opened again until 1900. They preserved the text as it stood before 9 centuries of editorial smoothing. In those earlier manuscripts, the 6th court passage does not describe torment in the standard punitive language used for the other courts. It uses a different vocabulary. It uses the Chinese term Chuming, which means literally to remove from the register. It uses the term Duan, to cut, to sever. And in the 7th court passages that follow, the manuscripts describe the soul as arriving with certain karmic threads already broken, and the officials of the 7th court note this in their records. The reading that has been proposed most extensively by a small group of comparative religion scholars working outside the mainstream Buddhological consensus is that the sixth court is not punitive in the same sense as the others. It is administrative. It is where a certain category of soul, the manuscripts specify the conditions, is removed from the karmic system entirely, not punished, deleted. The name is struck from the celestial register. The continuity is severed. What proceeds to the seventh court is a hollow, a body of information that no longer belongs to anyone. The wheel of rebirth at the 10th court has nothing to attach to. The soul does not return, not to a better life, not to a worse life, not to the hell realms, not to the animal realms. It is simply gone. The chain of causation that Buddhism calls samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death, is broken not by liberation, which is the goal of the practice, but by administrative erasure, which is its inverse. Liberation is the release of the soul from the wheel through wisdom. Erasure is the removal of the soul from the wheel by decree. The two outcomes look identical from outside. The soul is no longer reborn, but they are opposites. One is the highest attainment, the other is the deepest annihilation. The Sutra of the 10 Kings in its earliest manuscript form describes both, and locates the second one in the 6th court, under the seal of King Biancheng. The methodology that produces this reading is not exotic. It involves comparing the earliest datable Dunhuang copies against the later standardized versions, noting where the vocabulary has shifted and asking why. The earliest copies have been paleographically dated to the late Tang and early Song periods, roughly the 9th and 10th centuries CE. The later standardized versions, which became the basis for the Sutra as it circulated in Ming and Qing dynasty China, tend to smooth over the administrative vocabulary and replace it with more conventional punitive language. The shift is visible in the manuscripts themselves. The direction of the shift is from administrative to punitive, not the other way around. If the erasure reading were a later folk accretion, as some mainstream sinologists have suggested, one would expect the direction of the shift to be from punitive to administrative, with the later versions introducing the erasure language and the earlier versions preserving the original punitive intent. What the evidence shows is the opposite. The administrative vocabulary is in the oldest copies. The punitive vocabulary is in the later ones. This does not prove the erasure reading. It does prove that the erasure reading follows the direction of the manuscript evidence, and that the mainstream position runs against that direction. The scholars who have proposed the erasure reading are not fringe figures. They are working comparative religion scholars with degrees from recognized universities, publishing in academic venues that are simply outside the narrow specialty of Chinese Buddhist studies. Their reading has been available for some decades. It has not entered the standard textbook accounts of the 10 Kings tradition. The reasons for that non-entry are worth examining, and this video will examine them, but first the finding itself needs to be laid out in full. The specific manuscript that anchors the reading most clearly is one of the Dunhuang copies held in the Pelliot collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It is a short scroll, only a few meters in length, written in a clear scribal hand of the late 9th or early 10th century. The scribe wrote in a slightly older orthographic style than the other Sutra of the 10 Kings copies in the same cache, which suggests that this particular manuscript preserves an earlier version of the text. Whether it is the earliest surviving version, or simply an earlier version copied by a conservative scribe cannot be determined with certainty, but the linguistic features are consistent with a text composed in the late Tang period, rather than the early Song. The 6th court passage in this manuscript uses the term Chuming twice, once in the description of what King Biancheng does, and once in the description of the state of the soul, as it leaves the 6th court and enters the 7th. The 7th court passage in the same manuscript describes the officials of the 7th court as receiving a soul whose thread has been cut, and notes that such a soul cannot be assigned to the standard categories of processing that the 7th court normally handles. What the 7th court does with such a soul is not specified in the manuscript. The manuscript trails off, or rather the 6th court passage simply says that the soul that has been struck from the register does not proceed further in the same form. What proceeds is different. The specifics are not filled in. Whether this is because the scribe did not know, or because the source text did not say, or because the answer was thought too disturbing to write down, is one of the questions the reading opens. The manuscript is available for anyone who wants to consult it, either at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in person, or through the digital images available via the International Dunhuang project. The paleographic dating of the manuscripts is worth pausing over, because it is central to the argument. Chinese paleography, the study of the shapes and styles of characters as they were written in specific periods, is a mature discipline. Chinese scholars have catalogued the specific character forms used by scribes in specific dynasties and even specific reign periods. When a manuscript is examined, the shapes of its characters, the style of its ligatures, the way it handles certain rare or specialized graphs, all combine to give a paleographic date that is usually accurate within a few decades. The Sutra of the Ten Kings manuscripts in the Dunhuang cache have been dated by these methods. The earliest are placed in the late Tang period, roughly the 9th century. The middle range is placed in the Five Dynasties period, roughly the 10th century. The latest are placed in the early Song, roughly the 10th to early 11th century. The manuscripts that use the erasure vocabulary, Chuming and Duan, cluster in the earliest date range. The manuscripts that use the standard punitive vocabulary cluster in the later range. The paleographic distribution is not perfect. There is overlap in the middle range, but the direction of shift is clear. The older the manuscript, the more likely it is to use the erasure vocabulary. This is a testable observation. Any scholar of Chinese paleography with access to the Dunhuang manuscripts can verify it. The observation itself has been published in specialist journals of manuscript studies. What has not been done in the mainstream Chinese Buddhist studies literature is to draw the interpretive conclusion that the observation demands. If this reading of the Sixth Court is substantially correct, the implications extend well beyond a single Chinese Buddhist text. The Sutra of the Ten Kings is one node in a much larger network of afterlife records that stretches across Eurasia, and if the concept of soul erasure is present in the Chinese record, then the question becomes whether it is present elsewhere. The answer, when the surrounding literature is examined, is that it is. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the papyri of which are held in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and dozens of smaller collections, the soul of the deceased is brought before a tribunal of 42 judges in the hall of Ma'at. The heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of the goddess Ma'at. If the heart is heavier than the feather, if it is weighed down by the moral failures of the life just lived, the heart is fed to a creature called Ammit, whose name means devourer of the dead. Ammit sits waiting beside the scales. The Egyptian texts describe her as part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. She consumes the heart. And in the Egyptian understanding, the consumption of the heart by Ammit was not a punishment. It was an ending. The soul, without the heart, could not proceed. It did not continue to the fields of Aru, the Egyptian paradise. It did not descend to a hell. It ceased. It was unmade. The concept was called the second death. The first death was the death of the body. The second death was the erasure of the soul from the afterlife entirely. The Book of the Dead is a compilation of spells and instructions dating from approximately 1550 BCE onward, though its component texts are older. Some go back to the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, carved on the interior walls of the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara in approximately 2350 BCE. The pyramid texts also reference the second death. They are the oldest religious writings in the world, and the second death, the erasure of the soul by administrative or divine decree, is one of the concepts they describe. The chain of consequences, if the erasure reading holds, is long. Chinese Buddhism as it developed in the Tang and Song periods would need to be understood as containing a doctrine, however marginal, however contested within the tradition itself, that the soul could be ended by administrative fiat, quite apart from the doctrine of nirvana as the exhaustion of karma through practice. The Ten Courts tradition would need to be read not simply as a moral instruction manual, but as a bureaucratic technical document describing procedures with specific outcomes, one of which was total annihilation. The illustrated scrolls in the Musée Guimet and the British Museum would need to be recatalogued not as generic Buddhist purgatory art, but as visual records of a specific administrative process. And the network of Chinese afterlife text that surrounds and interacts with the Sutra of the Ten Kings, including the earlier Han Dynasty tomb inventories, the Taoist registers of the dead, the ancestral tablet traditions still practiced in Chinese families today, would need to be re-examined for other traces of the same erasure concept. Some of that work has been done in preliminary form. The Han Dynasty tomb inventories from Mawangdui, excavated in the 1970s from tombs sealed in the 2nd century BCE, contain lists of goods to be sent with the deceased and instructions for the celestial officials receiving them. Those instructions include, in several documents, references to keeping the deceased's name on the register of the honoured dead. The concern is that the name will be removed. The concern predates the Sutra of the 10 Kings by more than 1,000 years. It suggests that the erasure concept was not invented in the 9th century by folk Buddhists. It was already present in Chinese thinking about the disposition of the dead in the Han period. What the Sutra of the 10 Kings does is give the concept a specific location in the sequence of the courts and a specific administrative mechanism. The concept itself was older. The Mawangdui tombs, from which the Han Dynasty tomb inventories were recovered, were opened by archaeologists in the early 1970s, near the city of Changsha in Hunan province, in central China. The tombs belong to a marquis of the Han period named Li Chang, his wife, the Lady Dai, and their son. The Lady Dai's tomb was the most elaborately preserved of the three, and its contents included not only her almost perfectly preserved body, but also several hundred texts written on silk and on bamboo strips. Among those texts were funerary documents addressed to the celestial officials, a category of Chinese religious document that scholars now call the tomb inventory genre. These documents list the goods being sent with the deceased, and formally request that the celestial officials receive her, record her name on the register of the properly interred dead, and grant her the status appropriate to her rank in the celestial administration. The vocabulary of these documents is administrative and bureaucratic. The concern that the name might be omitted from the register, or that the deceased might be relegated to the category of the unremembered dead, is present. The Mawangdui documents predate the Sutra of the 10 Kings by more than 1,000 years. They demonstrate that the Chinese religious imagination had, from at least the 2nd century BCE, been organizing the disposition of the dead in explicitly administrative terms. When the Sutra of the 10 Kings appears in the 9th century with its 10 courts, and its named judges and its registers, it is not inventing something new. It is codifying in Buddhist form a bureaucratic afterlife imagination that had been developing in Chinese religion for at least a millennium, and the concept of erasure, of the name being struck from the register, has textual roots that reach back at least that far. Beyond the Mawangdui inventories, there are the Taoist celestial registers that developed in parallel with Chinese Buddhism during the late Han, 6th dynasties and Tang periods. Taoism developed its own elaborate bureaucratic imagery for the celestial administration, with named officials, specific offices, and detailed registers of both the living and the dead. Certain Taoist practices were aimed specifically at securing one's name on the correct celestial register, the register of the immortals, of the accomplished, of the properly initiated. Other Taoist practices, or rather other Taoist anxieties, concerned what happened when a name was removed from the register. The removal of a name, in Taoist thought, was equivalent to the loss of that name's cosmic anchor. The person, as a distinct being, ceased. What remained were the physical elements that had composed them, the vital energies, the material substances, which returned to the general pool of the cosmos. But the person, as a distinct entity, was gone. This Taoist doctrine of soul dispersal through deregistration was contemporary with the composition of the Sutra of the 10 Kings, and it circulated in the same cultural sphere. The Sutra's 6th court in the erasure reading is drawing on a concept that was already present in Chinese religious thought, the concept that the register itself constituted the soul, and that removal from the register meant the ending of the soul. If you want to check this yourself, the Book of the Dead spells are numbered in a system established by the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius in the 19th century, and spell 125, the Confession before the 42 Judges, is one of the most extensively translated passages in ancient Egyptian literature. Multiple English translations are available in public collections, including a widely cited edition by Raymond Faulkner published by the British Museum. The Mawangdui tomb inventories have been published in Chinese and are available in academic translation through several university presses. The Dunhuang Sutra of the 10 Kings manuscripts are accessible through the International Dunhuang Project, a collaborative digitization effort led by the British Library, which has made high-resolution images of many of the scrolls available for study. The parallel between the Egyptian second death and the Chinese 6th court erasure is not a coincidence in imagery. Both cultures produced elaborate bureaucratic afterlife systems, and both cultures included at a specific point in the sequence a mechanism for the total unmaking of the soul rather than its punishment or purification. The Egyptian mechanism operates at the level of the heart. The Chinese mechanism operates at the level of the register, the celestial bureaucratic record. But the outcome is the same. The soul is ended. It does not return. It does not proceed. It is not tormented. It simply stops. The Sumerian and Akkadian afterlife records, held in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection and in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describe a different underworld. The Kur, ruled by Ereshkigal, the older sister of Inanna. The Descent of Inanna, one of the earliest Sumerian narrative poems, tells of the goddess's journey through 7 gates into the Kur, at each of which she is stripped of one of her powers until she stands naked before her sister's throne and is judged. The Sumerian afterlife, in the standard reading, is not a place of purification or punishment. It is simply the place where the dead reside. Dusty, dim realm where the dead eat clay and drink dust. But the Sumerian texts also reference a category of the dead who do not enter the Kur. They are the anonymous dead, the ones whose names are not remembered by the living, whose funerary rites were not performed. These dead do not proceed to the underworld. They wander. They are erased from the register of the remembered. And in the ancient Sumerian understanding, this was a worse fate than any torment in the Kur, because at least in the Kur one existed. The unremembered dead did not exist. Their names were struck. The Sumerian mechanism for erasure is different in form from the Egyptian and Chinese versions. It is enacted by the failure of the living to perform the rites, rather than by the decree of a divine judge. But the outcome is again the same. The soul does not proceed. It does not return. It is not tormented. It stops. And the fact that 3 of the oldest bureaucratic afterlife systems in the historical record, the Sumerian, the Egyptian, and the Chinese Buddhist, all contain a mechanism for the erasure of the soul, as distinct from its punishment or its liberation, is not a fact that mainstream comparative religion has engaged with seriously. It has been noticed. It has been catalogued. It has not been analysed as a pattern. There is a further Sumerian document that deserves attention here, the tablets sometimes called the Nether World Ledgers, which are administrative-style texts recovered from the ruins of Nippur and Ur, held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum and in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection. The ledgers list the dead by name and status. They record which offerings were received on their behalf. They record adjustments, additions and, crucially, removals from the roster of the remembered. The vocabulary used for removal in the Sumerian tablets is different from the Chinese Chuming, but its function is equivalent. It is an administrative act. It cancels the name. The person, once removed, no longer receives offerings, is no longer prayed for by the living, and, in the Sumerian understanding, no longer sustains their existence in the Kur. Existence itself, in the Sumerian view, was dependent on being remembered. When the name went off the ledger, the person went with it. This is not a punitive doctrine. It is an administrative fact about the ancient religious universe, expressed in the vocabulary of the temple bureaucracies that maintained the ledgers. The parallel to the Chinese Sixth Court is closer than the Egyptian parallel in one specific way. Both cultures used the language of the register, of the roster, of the administrative list, to describe the mechanism of soul ending. The Egyptians used the language of the balance and the devourer. The Sumerians and the Chinese used the language of the ledger. The academic response to the erasure reading of the Sixth Court has been, in the pattern that has become familiar in these areas of study, silence followed by characterization. When the reading has been raised in academic contexts, at conferences on Chinese Buddhism, in review articles on Dunhuang manuscript studies, in occasional footnotes in comparative religion journals, the response has been to categorize the reading as a folk Buddhist accretion, a later addition to the text made by uneducated practitioners, an example of the ways in which the sophisticated original Buddhist doctrine was corrupted by popular Chinese religion. This characterization is available to any scholar who wants to use it. It does not, however, engage with the specific vocabulary in the Dunhuang manuscripts. The term Chuming, to remove from the register, appears in the earliest surviving copies. The term Duan, to cut, to sever, appears in the earliest surviving copies. The manuscripts that use this vocabulary are dated by paleographic analysis to the 9th and 10th centuries CE, which is when the Sutra of the 10 Kings appears to have been composed and standardized. They are not later accretions, they are the earliest layer of the text. The characterization of the erasure reading as a folk corruption of the original Buddhist doctrine assumes that there was an original Buddhist doctrine without erasure, from which the folk version departed. No such original has been produced. The Sutra of the 10 Kings does not have a Sanskrit or Pali source text. It is not a translation from an Indian original. It is a Chinese composition, drawing on Indian Buddhist concepts of karma and judgment, but assembling them in a new configuration. The claim that the erasure reading is a corruption of an earlier pure version is therefore a claim about a hypothetical source that has never been demonstrated to exist. The refutation of the erasure reading would require engaging with the specific manuscript passages, with what Chuming and Duan actually mean in 9th century Chinese Buddhist bureaucratic vocabulary. That engagement has not been published. What has been published are characterizations. The characterizations are made. The specific claim is not addressed. The pattern of dismissal without engagement is worth naming precisely because it is not unique to this case. It appears repeatedly in the study of ancient religious texts. A specific technical claim is made by a researcher who has looked closely at the primary sources. The claim is not refuted by producing a competing analysis of the primary sources. It is characterized as folk religion, as pseudo-scholarship, as a category error, as an example of a broader mistake in method, and then set aside. The dismissal requires no engagement with the actual passages. It requires only the characterization. Refutation would require the harder work of translating the passages differently, and showing why the alternative translation is more consistent with the manuscript evidence. That work has not been done. The mainstream position on the Sixth Court is, in effect, that the erasure reading cannot be correct, because the standard reading of Chinese Buddhist purgatory does not include erasure. The circularity is visible when it is pointed out. It is not visible in the usual scholarly discussion, because the specific manuscript passages are rarely quoted at length in the general literature. The Sutra of the 10 Kings in the mainstream framing is a purgatory text. The idea that it might contain a mechanism for the annihilation of the soul rather than its purification is not entertained, because that would require rereading passages that everyone has agreed to read a particular way. The academic infrastructure, the textbooks, the survey articles, the graduate curricula, is built around the standard reading. Changing the reading of one passage in the Sutra of the 10 Kings would require rewriting a great deal of infrastructure. The response, therefore, has been silence and characterization rather than refutation. This is not in itself an argument that the erasure reading is correct. It is an observation about the shape of the academic response. The reading has been proposed, it has not been refuted. The specific vocabulary of the earliest manuscripts is available to any scholar who wants to check. The specific form that the dismissal takes is worth documenting, because it is not simply an absence of engagement. It is an active characterization that does its work in a particular way. When the erasure reading is mentioned in surveys of Chinese Buddhist afterlife literature, it is typically raised in a paragraph or a footnote and immediately labelled. The labels vary. Some surveys call it a folk Buddhist accretion. Some call it an overreading of ritual vocabulary. Some describe it as an imposition of Western Christian soul concepts onto a Chinese Buddhist framework that does not have them. Some frame it as a sensationalization of a technical passage for popular consumption. The characterizations are made. The specific vocabulary that motivates the reading is not quoted. The paleographic evidence for the direction of manuscript shift is not addressed. The comparative parallel with the Mawangdui inventories and the Taoist registers is not mentioned. What is mentioned is the characterization, and the characterization is sufficient in the internal economy of the field to close the discussion without further examination. This pattern is not confined to Chinese Buddhist studies. It appears in Egyptology, in Assyriology, in Mesoamerican studies, in Vedic studies. Whenever a specific technical claim is made about a religious text that does not fit the standard framework the field has developed for reading that text, the response tends to follow the same shape: characterization without engagement, followed by silence. The alternative reading enters the specialist literature only rarely and is not incorporated into the survey literature or the graduate curricula. New scholars entering the field are trained in the standard framework and are not exposed to the alternative readings as serious options. Over time, the alternative readings become invisible, not refuted, simply not taught, and therefore not present in the working assumptions of the next generation of scholars. This is a general feature of how academic disciplines maintain themselves, and it is not in itself evidence that the standard readings are wrong or the alternative readings are right. But it does mean that alternative readings should not be dismissed simply because they are marginal in the current literature. Their marginality may be a feature of the field's internal dynamics, rather than a reflection of their evidentiary strength. There is a broader consideration here about how ancient religious texts get read in modern universities. The scholars who specialize in a particular textual tradition acquire, over the course of long careers, an interpretive framework that governs how they approach the primary sources. That framework is inherited from their teachers, who inherited it from theirs. Framework changes are costly. They require rereading everything already published and reteaching students who have been trained in the previous framework. Framework changes are therefore resisted, and the resistance is often expressed not as an argument against the new framework, but as a characterization of the new framework as unserious or fringe. This is not a criticism of individual scholars. It is a description of how academic disciplines maintain internal coherence. But it does mean that alternative readings, even alternative readings that follow the primary source evidence more closely than the standard readings do, face structural obstacles to acceptance. The erasure reading of the Sixth Court is one such alternative. It has not been shown to be wrong. It has been left aside. The response has been essentially silence followed by dismissal, and the specific manuscripts it draws on are still in the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, still available for anyone who wants to examine them, still saying what they have said since the 10th century, waiting for someone to read them differently. The wider civilizational context in which the Sutra of the Ten Kings was composed is itself worth examining, because the Sutra did not appear in isolation. It appeared in a specific historical moment, the late Tang and early Song dynasties, roughly the 9th and 10th centuries CE, when Chinese civilization was engaged in a massive project of synthesis. The Tang dynasty, which had reached its peak in the 8th century, was a cosmopolitan empire whose capital at Chang'an, modern Xi'an, was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population approaching 1 million people. The city was open to travelers from Central Asia, from Persia, from India, from Japan and Korea. Buddhism, which had entered China from India along the Silk Road beginning in the 1st century CE, had by the Tang period been transformed into a distinctively Chinese religion, with schools and lineages and monastic institutions that were increasingly independent of their Indian origins. The Sutra of the Ten Kings was one product of that transformation. Chinese Buddhism by the 9th century was engaged in absorbing and reconfiguring not only Indian Buddhist doctrine, but also Chinese Taoist cosmology and traditional Chinese ancestral religion. The Ten Kings, with their bureaucratic robes, their inkstones, their scrolls of judgment, look nothing like the Indian judges of the underworld. They look like Chinese magistrates. They sit in Chinese-style courtrooms. They keep Chinese-style registers. Their subordinates are demons drawn in styles that echo Taoist iconography. The synthesis is visible in the illustrations. It is visible in the language. The Sutra of the Ten Kings is a Buddhist text in doctrine, but a Chinese administrative document in form. The mechanism by which the soul is processed after death is described in the same vocabulary that 9th century Chinese officials used to process taxes, tributes, and criminal cases. The soul arrives. The soul is registered. The soul is documented. The soul is assessed. The soul is either forwarded to the next court, remanded for further examination, or, in the case of the Sixth Court in the reading that has been proposed, struck from the register. The bureaucratic vocabulary is important because it is precise. Chinese administrative texts of the Tang and Song periods use specific technical terms that had specific legal meanings. When those terms appear in a religious text, they carry those meanings. Chuming, to remove from the register, was not a metaphor. It was a specific administrative action. When a person died, their name was removed from the census register of the living. When a soldier deserted, his name was removed from the military register. When a monk left his order, his name was removed from the monastic register. The removal of a name from a register was a formal act with legal consequences. To apply that specific term to the disposition of a soul in the Sixth Court is to import that specific legal meaning. The soul is not being punished. It is being administratively unmade. The name that identified this particular karmic continuity is being struck from the celestial bureaucracy's records. The Tang dynasty itself, considered as a historical civilization, was a period in which the Chinese state was engaged in an unprecedented expansion of bureaucratic technique. The Tang Code of Laws, promulgated in 637 CE and revised several times over the following 2 centuries, was one of the most sophisticated legal documents produced anywhere in the world in its era. It defined thousands of specific offences, prescribed specific penalties, and established a hierarchy of judicial officials to process cases through a defined sequence of hearings and appeals. The Tang bureaucratic system organised the entire empire, hundreds of prefectures and thousands of counties, under a graded administrative hierarchy, with each level maintaining its own registers and reporting up to the level above. When a Tang subject died, their death was reported to the local county magistrate, who updated the census register, notified the tax authorities, and forwarded the report up through the administrative hierarchy. This bureaucratic procedure was so familiar to Tang citizens that when their religious texts described the disposition of the dead in the afterlife, the natural vocabulary was administrative. The 10 kings sit in courtrooms modelled on Tang magistrates' courtrooms. The registers they consult are modelled on Tang census registers. The seals and inkstones they use are modelled on the actual seals and inkstones of Tang officials. The Sutra of the 10 Kings, read in its full historical context, is a religious document that borrows systematically from the administrative language of the state. That borrowing is not superficial, the vocabulary is precise. When the Sutra uses the term Chuming for what happens at the 6th court, it is using a term that had a specific meaning in Tang administrative practice. It meant literally that the name was struck from the register. The name that identified this particular karmic continuity was struck from the celestial bureaucracy's records. What that meant in the religious imagination of the 9th century Chinese Buddhist was that the soul was administratively unmade, not tormented, unmade. The world in which the Sutra of the 10 Kings was written was, for all its bureaucratic sophistication, a religious world. Chinese cities of the Tang and Song periods were filled with temples, Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian, and religious observance was woven into the daily life of the population in ways that a modern secular reader can easily underestimate. In Chang'an, the Tang capital, the great Buddhist monasteries were staffed by thousands of monks who conducted continuous rituals for the imperial family, for the state, and for the private families that supported them. In Dunhuang, on the frontier, the ratio was smaller, but the pattern was the same. The monastery caves of Mogao were staffed by resident monks who conducted the mortuary rituals for the population of the oasis and its trade caravans. Death was a constant presence. Caravan travellers died on the road and were interred in the desert. Local residents died in their homes and were processed through the standard sequence of the 10 weekly observances. The families who commissioned the mortuary rituals paid the monasteries for their services, and the monasteries, which were substantial economic institutions with land holdings, tenants and endowments, depended on that income. The Sutra of the 10 Kings was not an abstract theological text. It was a working document, consulted by working priests conducting real ceremonies for the actual dead of a specific frontier town. Its contents were understood by everyone involved, the monks, the mourners, the neighbours, the local officials, as describing something that was actually happening to the deceased. This is important context because it reframes how the erasure passage in the 6th court should be read. If the passage described a rare theoretical possibility, one might expect it to have appeared only in specialist theological texts, but the Sutra of the 10 Kings was a document in general circulation, and its readers were not theologians. They were ordinary Buddhist families and the monks who served them. If the 6th court passage described the erasure of the soul as a possibility, then that possibility was in the working religious imagination of the 9th century population, not confined to esoteric doctrine. Ordinary people knew that their name could be struck from the register. Ordinary people knew that this was a possible outcome of the 6th court proceedings. This was part of the ambient religious anxiety of the culture. It shaped how people prepared for death, what merit they accumulated, what rituals they commissioned, what confessions they made. The presence of the erasure concept in the religious imagination of the population is what makes it significant. It is not a theological footnote. It is a description of what people believed could happen to them. The cave in which the Sutra manuscripts were sealed, Cave 17 of the Mogao complex, sits at the edge of the Gobi Desert, on what was once the westernmost frontier of Chinese civilization. The Mogao caves were dug into the cliffs above a small oasis near the town of Dunhuang, beginning in the 4th century CE. Over the following 1,000 years, hundreds of caves were carved and decorated, their walls covered with Buddhist frescoes, their interiors filled with painted statues of the Buddha and his attendants. At the peak of their use, in the Tang and Song dynasties, the Mogao caves were a major pilgrimage site and a repository for Buddhist texts. Cave 17 was not one of the large ceremonial caves. It was a small side chamber tucked behind a larger cave that had been dedicated to a specific monk. Sometime in the early 11th century, the exact date is debated, the chamber was filled with manuscripts, scrolls, paintings, and religious objects, and then sealed. A wall was built across its entrance. Frescoes were painted on the wall to disguise the seal, and for approximately 900 years the cave was forgotten. The reason for the sealing is not known with certainty. One theory holds that the manuscripts were sealed to protect them from an invasion. The Tang Empire, which was expanding across the region in the early 11th century, was known to have destroyed Buddhist libraries. Another theory holds that the cave was a repository for damaged or superseded texts, a religious equivalent of a geniza, the Jewish practice of setting aside worn-out sacred writings so they could not be destroyed. Whatever the reason, the seal held. The cave was found in 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had taken up residence at Mogao and was engaged in restoring some of the caves. He noticed a crack in the wall of the small chamber, opened it, and found the manuscripts. Wang did not fully understand what he had found, but he understood that it was valuable. He tried to interest Chinese officials in the discovery. Some manuscripts were removed and sent to Beijing, but most of the collection remained in the cave when Aurel Stein arrived 7 years later. Stein, a naturalized British subject born in Hungary, had already made 2 expeditions to Chinese Central Asia. He was fluent in the archaeological methods of the day. He negotiated with Wang Yuanlu. The negotiation was contentious and its ethics have been debated for a century, and eventually purchased several thousand manuscripts and paintings. He shipped them to London, where they were divided between the British Museum and the India Office Library. The manuscripts that concern the 10 kings were part of that first Stein acquisition. Paul Pelliot arrived in 1908. Pelliot, a French sinologist fluent in Chinese, spent 3 weeks inside the cave, sorting through the manuscripts by lamplight. He selected the ones that seemed to him most historically important, including additional copies of the Sutra of the 10 Kings, and negotiated their purchase for the French collection. What Wang Yuanlu did not sell to Stein or Pelliot was later removed by Chinese authorities and sent to Beijing, where much of it remains in the National Library. Smaller portions ended up in St. Petersburg, Kyoto, and Seoul. The Dunhuang collection is therefore scattered across the museums and libraries of the world, but the Sutra of the 10 Kings manuscripts are relatively well documented, and photographic reproductions of many of them are now available in academic publications. The specific passages describing the Sixth Court can be read by anyone who reads classical Chinese or who works from a good translation. The physical conditions inside Cave 17 when the seal was broken deserve some description because they are part of why the manuscript survived at all. The cave interior was dry. The Gobi Desert climate around Dunhuang has extremely low humidity year-round, and the sealed chamber preserved that dryness for 9 centuries. The manuscripts, stacked in bundles and packed with their painted covers facing outward, had suffered relatively little decay. Ink was still legible, paper was still flexible enough to be unrolled. Some silk paintings had lost their colour intensity but retained their imagery. Stein described the interior as smelling of old paper and dust, with the light from his lantern illuminating stacks of scrolls that had been sitting undisturbed since the 11th century. Pelliot's description is more detailed. He counted the manuscripts, sorted them by category, and made notes on their contents. He estimated that Cave 17 contained approximately 40,000 manuscripts and fragments. Not all of them were Buddhist. There were Taoist texts, Manichaean fragments, Nestorian Christian documents, secular administrative records, personal letters, contracts, and household accounts. The cave was, in effect, a snapshot of the textual life of a Silk Road oasis city in the late Tang and early Song periods. The Sutra of the 10 Kings manuscripts were only one small portion of that collection, but their preservation and their relative variety of copies, different scribes, different dates, minor variants in the text, has allowed scholars to reconstruct the textual history of the Sutra with a precision that would not otherwise be possible. Most Chinese Buddhist scriptures survive only in the standardized versions, produced by later imperial editorial projects. The Sutra of the 10 Kings, thanks to Cave 17, survives in its pre-standardization state. The variants that matter for the erasure reading, the specific vocabulary of the Sixth Court passage, are visible in the pre-standardization manuscripts. They are not visible in the later standardized versions, which smoothed them over. The paintings of the 10 kings that survive from the same period are worth examining alongside the textual manuscripts, because they encode the same information in visual form. The most complete surviving set is a series of scrolls now held in the Musée Guimet in Paris, part of the Paleo collection. Each of the 10 kings is depicted on a separate hanging scroll. The king sits on a throne dressed in Chinese official robes with an inkstone and a scroll of judgment before him. Attendants stand at his side, souls kneel at his feet. The specific tortures assigned to that court are illustrated below the throne. The scrolls are approximately 120 centimeters tall and 60 centimeters wide, painted in ink and mineral pigment on silk. They date to the 10th century. King Biancheng, the ruler of the Sixth Court, is depicted in his scroll seated on a black throne. His robes are dark, his inkstone is unusually large. In the illustration below the throne, the souls being processed are not shown being tortured, they are shown being examined. An attendant reads from a register, while another prepares to strike a name with a brush loaded with red ink. The visual grammar is administrative rather than penal. The other courts, in the same set of scrolls, show much more explicit torture. Souls being pulled apart, boiled, sawn in half. The Sixth Court scroll shows something different. It shows a name being struck from a register. The mainstream reading, when it addresses the Sixth Court illustration, tends to interpret the striking of the name as symbolic of the punishment being assigned. The alternative reading, which follows the manuscript vocabulary, interprets it literally. The name is being struck. The soul is being removed from the register. That is the punishment. That is the entire proceeding at the Sixth Court in the reading that has been proposed. Not the torment that appears in the other courts, just the erasure. The visual evidence is consistent with the textual evidence. The two forms of the record reinforce each other, and the fact that mainstream sinology has generally not engaged with this consistency, that the standard textbooks describe the Sixth Court as a court of specific punishments, and do not remark on the visual departure from the punishment iconography of the other courts, is itself notable. The evidence is available. The consistency is visible in the surviving artifacts. The reading that follows the evidence has not been given a serious scholarly refutation. It has been left aside. There are also related paintings held in the British Museum's Stein collection and in the Nara National Museum in Japan that show the same iconographic pattern. The British Museum holds a series of banner paintings and scroll fragments depicting the 10 kings, some dating to the 10th century and others to slightly later periods. The Sixth Court, in each of the British Museum examples, follows the same visual grammar as the Musée Guimet scroll. The king is dark-robed. The proceeding is administrative rather than penal. The register is prominent. The souls are being examined against the register, not being physically tormented. The Nara National Museum in Japan holds a set of 10 kings paintings that entered Japan from China during the medieval period, part of the transmission of the 10 kings tradition into Japanese Buddhism. The Japanese paintings, which are somewhat later in date than the Chinese originals but follow the Chinese iconographic conventions closely, also depict the Sixth Court in the administrative mode. The Japanese tradition in fact retained the erasure reading of the Sixth Court in some of its folk religious variants more clearly than the mainstream Chinese Buddhist tradition did. Japanese folk Buddhism speaks of a fate called mumyo, a state of being unnamed, unrecorded, no longer counted among the beings of the world, that is applied to certain categories of the dead. The Japanese folk tradition does not connect mumyo explicitly to the Sixth Court, but the concept is present, and the paintings show what the concept looks like when it is visualized. The name is struck, the soul is unmade. The visual record, taken as a whole across the surviving Chinese and Japanese examples, is more consistent with the erasure reading than with the standard punitive reading. The second death of the Egyptian tradition, examined more closely, offers a cross-cultural anchor for the Chinese Sixth Court reading. The concept of the second death appears in Egyptian religious texts across nearly 3,000 years, from the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom in approximately 2350 BCE, through the coffin text of the Middle Kingdom, to the Book of the Dead papyri of the New Kingdom and later periods. The formulation varies. The pyramid texts of Unas, carved on the interior walls of the Pyramid of King Unas at Saqqara, a pyramid that is smaller and less famous than those of Giza, but whose interior chambers preserve some of the oldest religious writing in the world, contain a spell that asks the king to be preserved from the second death, to not be forgotten, to not have his name blotted out. The Book of the Dead papyri, of which many hundred survive in various collections, contain similar spells. The Papyrus of Ani, held in the British Museum, is one of the most complete and best preserved examples, dating to approximately 1350 BCE. It measures approximately 24 meters in length. Its scenes of the weighing of the heart in the Hall of Maat are among the most reproduced images from ancient Egypt. In these scenes, the heart of the deceased is shown in one pan of the scales, the feather of Maat in the other. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, adjusts the scales. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, records the result. Ammit, the devourer, waits. If the heart balances against the feather or is lighter, the deceased proceeds to the fields of Aru, the Egyptian afterlife of paradise where the dead cultivate there, fields under the sun of the god Osiris. If the heart is heavier than the feather, Ammit consumes it, and the deceased ceases to exist. The Egyptian understanding of this cessation is very specific. It is not descent to a hell realm. Egyptian religion did not have a hell in the later Judeo-Christian sense, a place of eternal torment. What it had was existence and non-existence. Existence continued in the fields of Aru, or in the boat of the sun, God crossing the sky each day, or in the tomb where offerings sustained the deceased. Non-existence was the second death. And the second death was, in the Egyptian formulation, worse than the first, because the first was survivable, the soul continued in some form, and the second was not. The parallel to the Chinese Sixth Court is precise. Both traditions have a bureaucratic afterlife proceeding. Both traditions place, in the middle of that proceeding, a mechanism for the total ending of the soul as distinct from its punishment or its progression. In the Egyptian case, the mechanism is the weighing of the heart, and the outcome depends on the moral quality of the life just lived. In the Chinese case, the mechanism is the Sixth Court's examination of the celestial register, and the conditions under which erasure applies are less clearly stated in the surviving manuscripts, but they are stated. The Sutra of the Ten Kings specifies that certain categories of soul are subject to Chuming at the Sixth Court, and while the exact categories are debated among the manuscript variants, they include, in at least some copies, the category of the soul that has severed itself from the karmic continuity through certain specific acts. The independent attestation is what makes the parallel significant. The Egyptian and the Chinese traditions had no known contact when the Book of the Dead and the Sutra of the Ten Kings were composed. The Egyptian texts predate the Chinese by more than 1,000 years, and the two civilizations developed their religious literatures in geographically and linguistically separate spheres. The presence of the same specific concept, the erasure of the soul as an administrative outcome of the afterlife proceeding, as distinct from punishment or purification, in both traditions is not accounted for by any straightforward diffusion hypothesis. The conventional explanation offered by comparative religion is that both traditions independently invented the concept, because both traditions were sophisticated bureaucratic cultures who imagined the afterlife as a bureaucracy, and any sufficiently detailed bureaucratic afterlife will eventually include the possibility of administrative erasure. This explanation is coherent. It is also incomplete. It does not account for the specific consistency of the mechanism, that in both cases the erasure occurs at a specific point in the sequence, that in both cases it is depicted as a passive administrative act rather than an active punishment, and that in both cases it is regarded as a worse outcome than any punishment. The conventional explanation treats the parallel as coincidence. The alternative reading treats it as evidence that the concept describes something real about how the ancient bureaucratic afterlife systems understood their own operation. It is worth extending the comparative net further. The Zoroastrian tradition, preserved in the Avesta and the Pahlavi texts of ancient Iran, includes an afterlife judgment on the Jinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, over which the souls of the dead must pass. The righteous cross the bridge into paradise. The wicked fall from it into hell. But there is also a third category in the Zoroastrian scheme, less discussed in surveys of the tradition, the souls whose good and bad deeds are exactly balanced, who go to a place called Hamistagan, an intermediate zone of grey indistinction. And in some variants of the Zoroastrian afterlife theology, there is a further outcome for a specific category of soul, the soul so morally corrupted, so severed from Asha, the Zoroastrian principle of truth and cosmic order, that it does not fall into hell but is simply annulled at the bridge. The soul is not sent anywhere. It stops. The parallel here is thinner than the Egyptian and Chinese parallels. The Zoroastrian texts are less explicit about the mechanism, but the concept is present. 4 ancient bureaucratic religious traditions, none of them in direct contact with each other during their formative periods, all containing the same specific outcome as a possibility in the afterlife. The soul is unmade. The pattern is not coincidence, or if it is coincidence, it is a coincidence that requires explanation. The most serious objection to the erasure reading of the Sixth Court comes from within Chinese Buddhist studies itself, and it deserves to be presented fully rather than dismissed. The objection is this. The Sutra of the 10 Kings is a Chinese composition, and Chinese Buddhism inherited from Indian Buddhism a doctrine, the doctrine of anatman, or non-self, according to which there is no continuous soul to be erased in the first place. What passes from one life to the next in Buddhist rebirth is not a soul, but a stream of karmic consequences. There is no permanent essence. The stream continues until it is exhausted through the attainment of nirvana. In this framework, the concept of erasing a soul is incoherent, because there is no soul to erase. The apparent references in the Dunhuang manuscripts to Chuming and Duan must therefore mean something other than what a Western reader, imported from Christian or folk traditions with a substantive soul concept, would take them to mean. They might refer to the removal of a name from a specific list of the currently existing beings, without implying the ending of a continuous entity. They might be metaphors for the exhaustion of certain karmic threads that are eventually replaced by others. The technical vocabulary of the manuscripts in this reading is being over-interpreted through a lens that Chinese Buddhism itself would have rejected. This objection is serious. It is grounded in a real feature of Buddhist doctrine, and it is consistent with how most scholars of Chinese Buddhism have approached the tradition. It also, however, does not fully account for the way Chinese Buddhism actually developed in the Tang and Song periods. The absorption of Chinese ancestral religion and Taoist cosmology into the Buddhist framework introduced substantive soul concepts that were foreign to the Indian original, but were essential to the Chinese synthesis. The rituals surrounding the disposition of the dead, the offerings, the ancestral tablets, the names inscribed in family shrines, presuppose that something continuous survived death, that something was not called a soul in the classical Christian sense, but it functioned as a soul in the practical religious life of Chinese Buddhists. When the Sutra of the 10 Kings describes the soul being processed through 10 courts, it is describing that something. When it describes the removal of the name from the register at the 6th court, it is describing the ending of that something. The doctrinal objection that Buddhism should not have a substantive soul to erase is correct as a description of what Buddhism ought to have believed. It is incorrect as a description of what Chinese Buddhism, as actually practiced in the 9th and 10th centuries, actually taught. The Sutra of the 10 Kings is not a philosophical treatise. It is a ritual text used in the actual disposition of the actual dead. What it describes is what its users believed, and what its users believed, if the surviving vocabulary is read according to its administrative meaning, is that a certain category of soul could be removed from the celestial register at the 6th court and unmade. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. The doctrinal objection is real. The manuscript evidence is also real. The two sides have not been reconciled in the mainstream scholarly literature, and the current state of the discussion is that most surveys of Chinese Buddhist afterlife literature adopt the doctrinal reading and set aside the manuscript vocabulary. The reading that follows the manuscript vocabulary has been proposed. It has not been refuted. The specific passages are available. If the reading is substantially correct, if the 6th court of the Chinese Buddhist underworld, as documented in the earliest surviving manuscripts, is a mechanism for the administrative erasure of the soul rather than its punishment, the consequences for the study of comparative religion are not small. The parallel with the Egyptian second death would need to be re-examined not as coincidence, but as evidence of a specific concept present in multiple, independent ancient bureaucratic afterlife systems. The Sumerian references to the unremembered dead would need to be reread in the same light. The Zoroastrian annulment at the Chinvat Bridge would need to be added to the pattern. The 10 Courts tradition would need to be understood not as a Chinese Buddhist purgatory, but as a Chinese Buddhist adaptation of a much older and more widely attested afterlife structure, one in which the soul is not always saved, not always tormented and not always reborn, but sometimes simply unmade. The question of why so many ancient cultures included this specific concept in their afterlife records, and why the concept has largely disappeared from later religious traditions, which tend to offer only heaven, hell, or nothing, becomes a question worth asking. The Sutra of the 10 Kings is in the British Library, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in the National Library in Beijing, in smaller collections around the world. The illustrated scrolls are in the Musée Guimet and the British Museum and the Nara National Museum. The manuscript vocabulary is available to any scholar who reads classical Chinese. The Egyptian parallel is documented in every major museum with an Egyptian collection. The question is still open. The Sutra of the 10 Kings is in the British Library. The illustrated scrolls of the 10 Kings are in the Musée Guimet in Paris, and in the British Museum and in the Nara National Museum. The Papyrus of Ani is in the British Museum. The pyramid texts are carved into the walls of the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara, where they have been since approximately 2350 BCE. Stephen F. Tyser published his study of the 10 Kings tradition through the University of Hawaii Press in 1994. The Dunhuang manuscripts have been catalogued and photographed and made available in academic publications. What the sixth court of the Chinese Buddhist underworld actually does to the souls that pass through it, whether it torments them for lies committed in life, or whether it strikes their names from the celestial register and unmakes them entirely, is still open. It has been open since Aurel Stein pulled the first manuscripts out of Cave 17 in 1907. It is still open now,